This is Holding Court with Patrick McEnroe.
Well, you are an expert on all those things, and thank you. I mean, you've been involved in U.S.-China policy through your work with the U.S.-Asia Institute. You have a lifetime membership in the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations and Council on Foreign Relations. So you know all, and I always appreciate reaching out to you when issues do come up. And obviously the Peng Shuai situation I want to get back into with you because, as you said, it was at the forefront. It's not anymore. I want to get your reaction to that. But first, before we get into the sports, I want to talk just about Balloongate because I'm sure you have an opinion on that with the spy balloon. We assume it was a spy balloon shot down. When you first heard about that, Chris, were you surprised?
Well, no, I definitely wasn't surprised. I mean, obviously, we know there's spying going on between many nations, in particular the two superpowers. So that's obviously ongoing. I mean, my focus on it is really taking what's a tangible story and trying to use that to get more people invested in the challenge that China is on the United States and the rest of the West. As far as being an expert in sort of what has happened in the past with the balloons and what's been going on specifically in spying, we know it's happening. I've been reading the same stuff you guys have. I do believe it's probably been a relatively regular occurrence. It's hard to understand whether we're being told about this stuff happening because we're forced to or because they actually feel like, hey, this is the first time it's happened. We got to know. My guess is that it's happening on a relatively regular basis. And quite frankly, it probably is, because why would China do it at such a pivotal moment before Antony Blinken heads over there to China? I mean, in a way, you would like to believe that maybe this just happens all the time and this just happened to get discovered and brought to life in the press, and it's now damaged this whole visit. Unfortunately, every day I wake up and I go, wow, this is the worst I've seen the China-U.S. relationship, at least in my lifetime. I mean, remember, we did have a complete frozen relationship prior to 1971, which was about as bad as it gets, before some sort of kinetic warfare. This is definitely the worst I've seen in my life. And every day I wake up going, wow, it just got a little worse. So I think there's a massive need for a drastic rebalancing of the relationship between the two countries. We've been playing on this very uneven playing field that favors China for a very long time. And it's time to drastically but constructively rebalance it. What we don't want is war, and what we don't want also is complete non-communication between the highest levels of government. That just leads to what a lot of people refer to as the Thucydides trap, which is some event will occur, there's no communication, and it just spirals into some sort of kinetic conflict.
Well, you talk about it in your book, Feeding the Dragon, by the way, which is a great read, came out a couple of years ago. And you talk about Fenton's 5 forces of diplomacy in your book. So what are those 5 forces and how are they at work right now?
Well, you have national security, human rights, and politics, which are 5 of the forces that tend to bond countries, 3 of the 5 forces that tend to bond countries, sort of like 3 pillars of a cell phone to cell tower type of connection. We obviously have no agreement on any of those 3. So it really comes down to culture and commerce. Commerce, as we know, is a transactional trade activity that bonds nations. But what's more important is if you can create that second sort of bar on your connection, which is the cultural exchange, which is something that we've seen in the world of sports. Even a year ago, there was actually the Winter Olympics that happened over there in Beijing. Obviously, the WTA and men's tennis have had a long relationship with China. The NBA, which is something that I cover very closely in the book, does too. And when you look at the relationship between these two superpowers, in a way, I look at the China challenge as something that can actually bring together the United States of America, right? I mean, I'm wearing a Miracosta lacrosse sweatshirt today as a shout out to my son who plays lacrosse, right. And I got a Cheer Dad hat behind me. My daughter is a cheerleader. They rise up as a team when they play very tough rivals. It brings all those differences that all those kids have together to try to form a strategy and execute it on the field or whatever competition they have when they're playing their rival. That's something we need to do now with China. We need to get red, blue, purple, everybody from all walks of life behind this challenge come up with solutions and create a leverage that allows us to win what is going to be a competition for the next century.
And so I guess the way to find that balance, right, between the commerce, the competition between athletes and between countries, as we see in the Olympic Games, and then the culture. It seems to me the culture side of it is obviously the most challenging, because the Chinese government, they don't want their citizens, or 1.4 billion people, to have the same kind of opportunities, I guess would be the word, that we have in the United States. At the same time, we know as U.S. citizens, we're beholden to China from a commerce standpoint so much. And then, whether it's the movies, which obviously is your background, and the big, you actually were there in China years ago producing movies on site. How has that changed? We know what's happened in the NBA. We know Daryl Morey, who was the former GM of the Rockets, and the controversy that entailed. But where does it stand now? Because I've been watching it. Let's get into the sports side. We'll get into Peng Shuai a little bit later. But from the standpoint of the Olympic Games, and the controversies that entail there, what's the right path forward so that there can be these competitive situations, that this country, China, the biggest country in the world, can participate, but not kind of lose the balance, right, that you're talking about, which in the past has favored China, right?
Yeah, I think, unfortunately or fortunately, there's always compromise in any sort of relationship. And if you look at the things that are compromising or adjusting and weakening the foundation of this country, China is really pushing the limits. They're really testing us on our principles, our values, our free speech rights, etc. So when you look at the engagement that we have with them, I love the idea of having cultural engagement. I love the fact that they can see what they consider Western propaganda from the Hollywood studios and their theaters. I love the idea of our athletes going over there, or their athletes coming here and competing against us on world stages. Those are fantastic opportunities for diplomatic camaraderie and competition, right? Where it gets muddied is when China tries to enforce the kind of system, the kind of rules, the kind of laws that they want their own people to have on us. And what I mean by that is, if you look at Daryl Morey, who you bring up, the GM of the Houston Rockets, who now is working with the Philadelphia 76ers, he tweeted 7 words: "Fight for freedom, stand with Hong Kong," while he was on some sort of a trip to Japan. That was not done in China. Mm-hmm. That was done in Japan, in the free world. But what China said, what Beijing said, was that is not acceptable to essentially bifurcate Hong Kong from China. What China was doing with Hong Kong, those protests were wrong, et cetera, et cetera. Don't stand with the people of China of Hong Kong fighting for democracy. That's wrong. That's really wrong in so many manners to us and to Daryl Morey too, because Daryl Morey was not inside China tweeting that out. He was outside of China, and he should have every right that's protected in whatever that country and sovereign nation is at the point where he does that. And China said, no, you don't. You need to follow what our narrative is. And because you didn't, NBA, you're going to get penalized, because that one guy is the GM of the Houston Rockets. The Houston Rockets have a big following in China. We're now going to tell all the sponsors of the NBA that they can no longer sponsor the NBA. We're going to tell the platforms that are airing NBA games that they can't air NBA games anymore. And we're going to do this until you guys apologize, you grovel, you do everything in your power to make that wrong a right, in Beijing's viewpoint. Now, what was great about that is that it created all kinds of controversy in the West. And the West looked at that and said, how dare you, Beijing? But the problem is the money's so big, that carrot that's dangled with that China market is so large that it's very hard to do the right thing. And for any one person that does the right thing, somebody that's willing to do the wrong thing for a buck can come in and take their place.
You're listening to Holding Court, everyone. Chris Fenton joining me. He's a great follow, by the way, on Twitter. I follow him and learn a lot. It's The Dragon Feeder. That's your handle, right? Because it's Feeding the Dragon, the name of the book.
Holding Court is powered by Mudhouse Media.